of Oriental artists was the Japanese painter and woodblock designer Hokusai. There was a brief article about him not long ago in the Reader's Digest, in which it described him under a name he gave himself, the old man mad with drawing. Hokusai lived to be approximately 90 years old, and during practically his entire lifetime, he dedicated every moment of his waking time to drawing and painting. He became a genius of such extraordinary merit that he has gained worldwide recognition and has exercised a very considerable influence upon Western art. Hokusai was regarded as an eccentric in his own time because he rather abused a common practice among Japanese intellectuals. And when an artist or a musician or a writer or a poet developed a new style or seemed to make a step of new growth within his own nature, he gathered his friends about him, sent out a formal invitation in the form of a delicately designed ceremonial, a little picture, and took this occasion to formally announce his change of name. Because whenever he did something new or important or different, he had a new name. Because he was no longer that old person anymore. He was now the new person. Of course, Hokusai lived a long time, but it's considered that he was rather generous in this procedure, as he is believed to have changed his name over 90 times. This was considered somewhat irregular, even among his own friends. But he went blissfully along, producing art under so many names that it is probable that some of the pieces will never be with certainty identified. But a study of his work shows that each time he changed his name, something happened in the thing he was doing. It was not arbitrary. It represented a new birth in himself. And a new birth means a new person. And a new person means, in a mysterious way, release from the limitations of the old person who no longer exists. There can be no new person without this release. And one of the things that each individual has to release in order to become a new person is his own past. He cannot cling to the attitudes and ideas, to the beliefs and policies, to the standard of living and thinking, which have belonged to some previous name or personality. Now, this peculiar practice was not limited to Japan. We find in Egypt the reference to new names. We know that in the Greek and Egyptian mystery rituals, those who passed the initiation test were given new names. We know that among the American Indians, the child growing into maturity, taking the tests of his tribe, was given a new name. And in the book of Revelation, there is described a white stone upon which a name is inscribed that shall be given to the one who overcomes the world. This new name is a new self. And this philosophy, while it occurs in many countries, is perhaps closer to the Buddhistic philosophy than it is to the religions of some other peoples. Because in Buddhism, there is no recognition of a continuous, unchanging personality from the cradle to the grave. It is true that when we look in the mirror, there may be certain continuing resemblance. But the Oriental is not as much concerned with what he sees in the mirror as what he knows in his own heart. And as this heart changes, these changes, if they are real, these will result in the establishment of a new personality. In Buddhism, the personality of man is in continual motion. Therefore, the individual at 40 is not the same person that he was at 20. If by some peculiarity of temperament he would seem to be the same person, this is not an achievement, this is a loss. The person who remains the same is the person who has not succeeded, who has not achieved the primary purpose for life, and that is the continual outgrowing of old selves, which are left behind like the shells on the seashore. The important thing is to outgrow the self as we know it, and by this continually becoming more, to achieve constantly to a new self. Now, a new self is not primarily a new attitude. It is not a new intellectual attachment. It is not a person joining one thing or departing from something else. A new self is an interior transformation. And it is the purpose of philosophy and religion that this transformation process shall be continuously progressive, forward, upward, and better. The individual who by circumstances appears to change for the worse, who seems to be less at his end than at his beginning, has therefore lost most of the meaning and significance of the great process of growth. He also suffers, as do those who grow too slowly, from the continual loss of adjustment between the individual and the society around him. He is only contemporary if he continues to grow. Now, we may say that the contemporary way of things is not always good. Therefore, adjustment to it is not always desirable. These statements are true. But the ability to understand it, to understand now, to be able to consciously experience now whether to accept or not to accept, this ability is important. For without it, we suffer needless pain. Without it, we have no way of orienting ourselves. We lose sight of natural integrity. We begin to wonder if the universe is going wrong. We wonder why things seem to move by and leave us behind. And gradually, if we are left behind, we crystallize, lose the power of individual action. Thus, it is important that each individual has the experience, not necessarily of changing his physical name, but its equivalent, of so changing himself that he might be regarded as a different person, and therefore might be entitled to a new name. Perhaps the Oriental policy is not so bad, because we gradually make an identification with our name. It can become a terrible block to our progress. If the name is Smith, and we must spend our lives being true to Smith, we are in a very bad way. If, however, we recognize that Smith was a name perhaps we were born with, or a name perhaps with which we grew up and became intimately associated, but that Smith does not stand for or represent a static being who will always be Smith. It stands for a dynamic, a symbol that must ever change. And we must either change the name or else change the identity with which we recognize the name, or change the person with whom the name is associated. And if the name remains the same, sometimes perhaps it is a little harder for us to escape an old identity, so the elaborate ceremony of simply discarding a name is not always so wrong or so lacking, perhaps, in psychological importance to ourselves. If the name is Smith, we may blame that Smith in us for things we did long ago. But if that Smith is no more, and we have a new person and a new being, perhaps it will help us to escape into the future and depart from these old ties that have bound us to a crystallized concept or pattern. Now, of course, among these Japanese artists, it was not uncommon for a master to bestow one of his old names upon a favorite disciple. Now, this might be an interesting procedure also. This was another type of very subtle reminder that the disciple has taken on the name of his master. The disciple very carefully methodically following his master's instruction, is no longer himself. He is gradually a little shadow of the master. Therefore, perhaps, as the master grows on, he leaves his old name to the disciple who has earned it. And, to use the argot of our day, may be stuck with it. Now, the disciple, being part of this common tradition, is tremendously honored by receiving this name. Sometimes we are quite flattered when some honorable name is associated with our own. We think it's wonderful if someone suspects us of having some of the attributes of Abraham Lincoln. We feel that nothing could be a greater compliment. In a way, this is true. But also the artist who receives the cast-off name of his master, like an old coat, is proud when he receives it, and he goes faithfully along his way, doing what the master taught him, drawing like the master, painting like the master, writing poems that sound so much like the master's that the only difference is that the disciples probably are not quite so meritorious. And then after a while, the disciple begins to realize that he is a being, a person, that he is something in himself, that he is more than merely a shadow. So in due time, he comes to the conclusion that he has certain attitudes and attributes of his own. Therefore, he will attempt to branch out. He will introduce innovations into the old pattern that was given to him. He proceeds to try to escape from influence into self-expression. And if he achieves this desirable end, then he also gathers his friends, sends out his suramono, and announces a change of his own name. He is now going to be himself. It's a pretty little ceremony, and it also has a very rich value if we begin to estimate. As Hokusai himself said, that it is terrible to die a slave to the reputation of a name. But sometime, somewhere, this name was important. We can never forget it, whether we remain important or not. If its purposes are completed, if its services have been rendered, then release it and have a new name and go on to new things. But do not bind them with the old. This thinking opens a very interesting area of thought, which has a direct bearing upon the problem of our book. Namely, the vital value of the individual attaining a degree of consciousness or an integration of consciousness by means of which he is suddenly liberated from his own past, from his own insufficiency, and also perhaps from certain associations which he has come to regard with too much fondness. We all need freedom. The purpose of our realization is to achieve this freedom from the limitation of the past. Naturally, we are going forward. Naturally, we will enter new conditions of limitation, because as veil upon veil we lift, we find veil upon veil behind. But always this advancement is into a larger area of consciousness. More achievement. Something is added by which we become new beings under the sun. And by this newness, we mark our progress. For this progress is an ever newness in ourselves. Our most perfect and successful means of overcoming such problems as the traditional problem of age, in which Hokusai always believed the new name was a new birth. He was a baby again, starting out in a new universe. And even to the very last years of his life, he lived in a world of tomorrow, of things forever new, and only wished that he might add a few more years to his life so that he could become as great as he longed to be. This ever newness, therefore, is an escape from a whole group of psychological restrictions, by means of which we very often limit our own ability to grow. This newness brings to us the very key to our realization problem. The Bible speaks of the time when all things shall be new. And this is the moment of personal growth. Growth is this forever becoming new. A very difficult thing to explain, for it can only be known through experience. It must be felt. It must be inwardly experienced. And not long ago, I was reading an old commentary relating to the yogas. Found another interesting thought bearing upon this particular subject. It had to do with the idea that through the disciplines of yoga, certain controls of the body could be affected. Certain abilities latent in the ordinary person could be intensified. It was quite conceivable that certain extrasensory perceptions could be stimulated. All these could result also in the gradual recognition that the yogic practice had produced a great soul, a being superior to the average person in his power of mind over body and emotion. The great question, as this particular author pointed out, however, is this: in what way is the consciousness of this man changed? Does he think with the same mind? Does he feel with the same emotions? Has this change that he has wrought actually changed him to the bone, to the innermost part of his own nature? Is he opening new eyes to look at a new world? Or is he merely intensifying certain faculties and skills and gaining the magician's control over certain rudimentary elements of nature? If this person is not deeply and wonderfully and miraculously changed, then the so-called exercises or disciplines have really achieved little, if anything. And Buddha tells us how we shall recognize essential change. Inasmuch as this change, coming as it must from within, becomes like a radiant center, touching and unfolding all of the faculties and powers of the nature, releasing these through the miracle of the transcendent being, so that the person who is really changed from within in the direction of the newer and the better will always be able to note this change, and others will note it in the simple and direct improvement of his own character. There can be no growth which does not result in the gradual unfoldment of virtues and the gradual falling away of vices. There is no growth that is important that does not make the person bigger in relationship to problems. If he cannot solve things better than he did before, the so-called achievement is either merely intellectual or physiological. If the person, having attained a larger insight, is not able to express this largeness through patience, through kindness, through understanding and sympathy, through tolerance, through the correction of excessive attitudes, if this person is not a better friend, a better parent, a better husband or wife, or a better child, then these disciplines have failed. We also know that subtle factors gradually insinuate themselves into the spiritual ambitions of many people, and that these ambitions often take over, and the individual's aim is to excel others rather than to unfold himself. His ambitions may cause him to direct his energies and endeavors towards certain specific ends which he himself desires. And by these ambitions, the natural newness of his nature is locked by the old habits and the old attitudes which he has not changed. If a person moving from one degree of understanding to another retains all the pressures of the older viewpoint, then he has not really changed. He has not really grown. And no amount of intellection, no amount of scholarship, no amount of magical power can in any way compensate for the simple process of changing. This changing which results from the person's understanding of life deepening as a result of the growth he is attaining. So self-unfoldment is really this continual unfoldment of value, so clearly set that there can be no doubt that the person who has proceeded along the path is warmer and richer in those virtues which we all recognize to be right, and therefore that this person is more enjoyable, more companionable, richer and deeper in sympathy and understanding. These are the tests, these are the points which make the new person. The new person is not one who has simply intellectualized himself out of a previous mood. He's a person with a new mood, a new nature, a new being, rejoicing in its escape from some ancient bondage. For that man must forever escape from the bondage of his own past, his own old ideas, his own well-set habits, the traditions which have crowded and cramped him through the years, the ambitions which have led him in one degree of life will not be sufficient to lead him in the next. If these do not change, he is not changing. And if he is not changing, he is not growing. These points are not emphasized as they should be. And therefore, we have a great many people striving very hard, trying their best to grow, but unable to do so successfully, so that they know a little more than they did. But they are not more in themselves than they were. And out of this, we have a very sad delay in the natural tempo of growth. The difference, of course, is that we can change our opinions as a result of contacts with others. But we become new beings as a result of release from within ourselves. This is the important element in growth. Now I want to bring up a few special points that we have marked here in the book, which I think will have some bearing upon the points we want to make, and I hope they will help you. You know the material that we are covering this evening will be derived from chapters 8, 9, and 10. A number of the friends have told me that they have been reading and studying the book as they went along, and I think this will help, because naturally it would be of very little value for me to simply read the book to you. The point is to try to bring in new levels of thinking, new symbols, new incentives to the particular end which we seek to achieve. In the 8th chapter, under the heading of motive, we have a line in italics. And this line is something that could be read over rather quickly and passed on. But that would, I think, be a mistake, because perhaps it is one of the most important statements in the entire book. It arises from a mention of the rose garden of Sardis, which is one of the great mystical works of the Sufis. And in this context, I insert the following statement. The rose garden is for the one who loves the roses. Now this is so extraordinarily simple that I wonder if everyone has given it the attention they should. Because perhaps it is the key to the entire practice of realization and the entire path of self-unfoldment. In Sardis, the rose garden becomes the symbol of the illumined life. It becomes an emblem of man's internal awareness. It is the secret garden, the garden of virtue and value, which he is establishing in his own consciousness. And in this problem of the rose garden, each individual becomes the gardener in this mystic garden of his own soul. So if you have a garden of your own, somewhere out back or in front, or on a windowsill, or perhaps if you lived many years in New York, that proverbial rubber plant on the fire escape. But whatever you may have, the problem of the garden is important. You go and you talk to people who have gardens, and you say, why? One individual will say, well, my neighbor has one, and they look rather good out in front, you know, and also if they grow up enough, I won't have to paint the house so often. You can get all kinds of recommendations. One of the classic answers to any penetrating question in the United States is a slurred, I don't know. This seems to imply a completely negative attitude. The individual is just doing it. Another person is raising flowers because he's a member of the garden club. And that year they're going to exhibit roses, and he's hoping to take the first prize. This can cause him a great deal of concentration and also a great deal of sorrow if his pet rose doesn't hold up until the proper day. Another individual is taking up gardening at his doctor's suggestion. He needs more outdoor exercise. Another one is attempting to use a garden as a means of getting a certain amount of emotional release. They're a little frustrated, you know. They don't have very much creative expression. Then there's always that health expert who does it because of the vibrations from the earth. You can have almost anything you want as an answer to why to have a garden. But the old Persian mystics took the attitude that the only person who really has a garden is the one who simply loves the roses. That's all. If you are doing this for any reason except that it tells something about your own consciousness, you are doing it for some reason that is not fully worthy. And in the growth of the individual, the development of the garden of his inner life, this is peculiarly and importantly true. The individual who is growing to outgrow pain is failing. The individual who is growing competitively is failing. The one who is seeking to unfold greater power so that he may be more successful in some way is more or less failing. And the person who believes that consciousness will enable him to bear the weight of an unfortunate bargain is also failing in his purpose. Every ulterior motive is essentially and basically wrong. Now, I know that ulterior motives today are very difficult to escape, and sometimes, to a limited degree, they are necessary. We take a person under very severe psychic stress or psychic tension, and we give this individual escapes. We give him or try to find for him mechanisms by means of which he will be able to achieve self-expression on a non-dangerous level. We say to the individual, find yourself avocational outlets. Find new interests. Plant a garden. We may even suggest to him that this is a good way for him to counteract certain pressures in his own life. But this is to be understood in the same way that we recommend exercise or diet. It is the same as recommending a remedy. This is on the level of medication. This is on the level of an effort to achieve a scientific compensation for a recognized physical problem. This particular phase of our subject does not essentially belong under the heading of religion. This is not a philosophical end, merely an effort to correct a condition temporarily or in part so as to prevent a serious crisis from arising in the life of the individual. But when we go beyond our human problem, when we try to surmount the obstacle of personality by a direct dedication or devotion to principles,